Roughly 3 years ago, I went on Viz Media's website and saw this. It was the official English release for Akira Toriyama's Manga Theater. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically this collection of 3 manga volumes of one-shots that Toriyama worked on, mostly before he worked on Dragon Ball, all collected into this one very nice hardcover for the English release. But I didn't care. I was obsessed with collecting manga and loved Dragon Ball, so when I saw this on the website, I just said, you know what, 40 bucks? Sure, take my money. And then I waited a week, and then it arrived in the mail, and then I never read it. No particular reason, I just never got around to it. But then it happened. Toriyama tragically passed away at the age of 68. This broke me up personally because Toriyama has always been somebody I admired. I grew up obsessed with Dragon Ball. I saw all 4 of the anime shows, I bought the merch, I played the video games, maybe a little too much, and it just genuinely broke my heart when I woke up that morning to a black and white photo of his face. So while everybody's out here talking about his 2 most iconic works, I wanted to do something different. Because even though Toriyama is one of the most influential mangaka of all time, there is this good chunk of his work that is just never talked about as far as I can tell. It's so weird, like here is everybody talking about Dragon Ball, some even talking about Dr. Slump, but nobody wants to give a chance to the little guy. And like I get it, like these works do not have anywhere near the same level of impact as Dragon Ball and Dr. Slump, but god damn it do they still have worth. If it weren't for these one-shots, Dragon Ball would have never been made, Toriyama would have never been crowned the king of manga, and by extension most of the works that define the 2000s would just immediately cease to exist. So I think it's time to take the old hardcover off the shelf and give this small part of the man's legacy the spotlight that it deserves. This is the shy beginnings of a problematic office worker turned comic superstar. This is the amateurish and at times problematic manga of the 1980s, and this is Toriyama before, during, and after Dragon Ball. But first, what do I mean when I say every one-shot manga? Because Manga Theater doesn't even have all of his collected works, just the most noteworthy ones. There are one-shots that went initially unreleased. There are one-shots that were never translated to English. There are one-shots that are debatably one-shots to begin with. Are the 3-chapter long short stories one-shots? Well, not really, but they're too short to be a mini-series. On the same note is something like the 14 chapters of Sandland, a series even though it's collected in 1 volume. For the sake of this video, I am going to be talking about every single manga that Toriyama worked on outside of anything connected to Dr. Slump or Dragon Ball. This means that I will be talking about every single one-shot Toriyama worked on, most of which are collected here in Manga Theater, but I'll also be talking about some of the miniseries like Kawa and Sandland. Why am I not talking about his 2 most iconic works? Like, do I really have to? You know how many videos there are talking about Dr. Slump? God forbid, you know how many goddamn Dragon Ball videos there are? The fucking Mexican government streamed the final episode of Dragon Ball Super, okay? Originally, I thought reading all of these manga would be like a fun trip down a part of the man's legacy that I don't see often talked about on the internet. What I did not realize is that reading all of these works took so much longer than I thought it would. I have read so many goddamn manga chapters. There were some that just gave me this sense of magic unlike anything I've read in manga in quite a while. And then others just made me want to bleach my eyes out, what can I say? This video is a tribute to the man that has influenced me heavily and millions of others across the world, and I hope you enjoy. First, a little backstory. Japan, 1970s. In middle school, a teenage Akira Toriyama didn't stand out from his classmates. Being a kid in cram school, he spent his time buzzing around the neighborhood with classmates, going to toy shops, eating ramen, and watching old movies. There wasn't a lot a kid could do with his free time in the 70s, so little Toriyama took pleasure in drawing like many of the other kids. Apparently he was pretty good at it from a young age and knew he had talent when he drew one of the dogs from Disney's 101 Dalmatians, which according to him had precisely the right proportions. But the day that changed everything was when he went to the house of a friend who happened to have an older brother with a massive collection of manga, causing him to not only develop an interest in illustration, but to panel and frame his own stories. This set him on the path to become an illustrator. Success, however, was not something he flirted with. After graduating a high school focusing on the creative arts, Toriyama had two options: either follow his childhood ambitions of becoming an illustrator or get a boring desk job. So of course, he picked the boring desk job. Like, he needed money, and taking the route most Japanese students took after high school made sense. I mean, he sucked ass at it. He was always late, never followed the dress code, and was considered the problem child of the office. So one day he said, you know what, fuck it. He quit his job and told himself he was gonna figure it out later. That was when he walked into a cafe and saw it. The manga magazine Shonen Jump was calling for submissions, and he was more than ready to brush up his artistic skills to create a new manga, something he hadn't done since high school, if only to get some money to maintain himself. The rest is not really history because he started out rough, really rough. Which brings us to the first volume of Manga Theater, which collects this first manga in question as well as a few others from his early years. The first thing you'll notice in these early works is that, well, they are definitely that of a beginner. None of the defining features and storytelling tropes we'll see develop over the next couple of volumes are present here, as Toriyama is still finding his footing as an artist. But let's start with his first ever one-shot from that Shonen Jump submission, Wonder Island from 1979. This manga sucks, which is totally cool. I mean, you can't expect him to knock it out of the park in his first published manga, and hey, at least... No, this is just terrible. Wonder Island follows this guy who is stuck on an island and is desperately trying to fly to get out of it. Or at least that's what I think it's about, because... yeah, my god, there is so much text. I mean, this isn't that much text in comparison to something like a Stan Lee comic book, but one of manga's strongest attributes in comparison to comics is telling a story with minimal dialogue and narration, which this manga does not take advantage of. Not to mention the writing is so unnecessary and clunky. For 2 days and nights, I held on for dear life until finally I ended up on this island. Like, this is bloated. It would be much better to just say, for 2 days I held on until I ended up on this island. The writing reeks of insecurity and riddles the page with clunkiness that gets in the way of any of the jokes actually being funny. I know this is probably like a translation thing, but considering some of his later and more refined works don't have this problem, I'm assuming we saw this kind of stuff in the original Japanese as well. There are some decent gags here and there, but it's all lost in a story that has no cohesion. I've read this thing twice already, and I still don't fully understand what it's even about. And I'm not the only one who thought this. When this manga initially released, it ranked at the bottom of the reader polls, which kind of sucked for newbie Toriyama, but it didn't deter him. In fact, it pissed him off so much that he made such an unpopular manga that instead of taking the paycheck and leaving like he was originally going to, he kept making manga out of sheer spite. He's just like me after getting super armor charged by Broly for the 300th time. After Wonder Island, he made a few more manga in the same style with similar results, including a sequel to Wonder Island, a Highlight Island, and one about a weirdly sexualized woman. Yeah, that one was extra terrible. The results? Mostly the same. These 4 manga vary little in style and joke telling. We can see Toriyama wants to make funny gag manga by focusing on the ridiculous and absurd, but once again, so much of it is lost by just the sheer amateurism at play. The page layout is repetitive, dialogue thick and bloated, the jokes are either too on the nose or too simple to get a laugh. There are some panels here and there that made me chuckle, but that chuckle was not worth reading 50 pages worth of content. Like, I'm genuinely struggling to try and come up with more stuff to say about these works, but they're just so boring that I feel like I'm reaching for things to say. Luckily, it looks like Toriyama learned everything he needed from these early works, because our next manga is going to mark the first big turn in his style of craft. Even though he had only worked on a handful of not really popular manga, Toriyama was given a shot at a serial for Shonen Jump magazine, which is pretty cool. Even cooler than that was that the manga he ended up pitching was not only immediately published, not only was it his first big success, but it was fucking Dr. Slump. That's right, one of the most successful manga of all time was this guy's like 5th proper work. And when I mean Dr. Slump was a hit, I mean it was insane. It got an anime adaptation just 6 months after the manga debuted, which is unheard of even today. The anime was a massive hit and it made Toriyama a household name almost immediately. And it looked like his work on Dr. Slump also impacted his way of crafting manga, because our next one-shot, Polo and Roid, is so much better than what we've seen so far. Let's start with the story, cause it's simple. Guy meets girl, guy falls in love with girl asks him to fight bad guy for her, guy does that, and they live happily ever after. While this seems like a rather simple story, it does mark the point where Toriyama starts using traditional narrative structure to make a one-shot that's so much more effective than what we've seen before. This one-shot is divided by acts. Specifically, there's 15 of them, which, you know, first I've ever heard of 15 acts, but whatever. Unlike the constricted and confusing mess that was the Island compilation, Polo and Roid feels distinctively polished with a linear story that builds momentum over its apparently 15 acts. Sorry, I just can't get past that. The action is visceral and impactful. Instead of filling in the page with as many panels as a weak piece of paper can hold and more nonsensical text than the goddamn Odyssey, Toriyama lets the page breathe. These panels work in rhythm. Every page, dedicated to dialogue and exposition, is followed by pure spectacle and action, letting the art speak for itself and the manga to enter the state of flow that Toriyama would go on to master. Speaking of the art, I mean, just look at it. The designs are goofy yet creative, the environment's natural, the characters alive. There's even some elements that will come to fruition in his later work, like this girl's armor, which is identical to Chi-Chi's, or the design for the minions that evolved into Toriyama's personal avatar. This is still his early works, which is a far cry from the sharp and buff designs we'd see in something like the Boo Saga, but it works. It just works. Polo and Roid is everything you'd want from a one-shot manga in the 80s. It is a big burst of fun with a to-the-point story. It has been massively overshadowed by the author's later works, but after reading Island to the Power of 4, it's a breath of fresh air. And apparently, Jump's readership thought the same thing, because this manga earned a Reader's Choice Award in the year it came out at #1, which I think is well deserved. It even gave Toriyama the chance to visit Europe for the first time and see the Matterhorn. Oh hey, I've been there! This was truly one of the manga redemption arcs of all time. But it was far from the end of Toriyama's career as we move on to the next piece in Manga Feeder Volume 1, Madmatic. This is the next step in Toriyama's career with an entirely new story and cast of characters. But first, let's start with the story. Okay, guy meets girl. Guy falls for girl. Girl asks guy to fight bad guy for him. Guy fights bad- wait a minute. This is just the same shit as the last manga! But like, with the dragon! It affrays her! Okay, that part was pretty funny. The one thing you'll realize when reading these manga in the collected volumes is that Toriyama loves to recycle. And it's not just Madmatic, pretty much every manga for the forthcoming volumes will follow a near identical formula with different settings. The protagonist is going to be a guy who fights, there's going to be a love interest who maybe calls him a pervert and beats him up, they reconcile, the cocky bad guy shows up who gets bodied by the MC, repeat infinitely. Really, my favorite part was when he said it's Madmatic time and then Magmatic all over Super Armor's Broly. The biggest actual improvements here are on the paneling and art. More splash pages, more monster designs, more action. I will say you start to see a lot of the characteristic paneling that Toriyama would go on to master. Look at the verticality of this panel. Toriyama starts by getting your attention of this big, wide open space before naturally guiding you down to the main figure of the image. It creates the dynamism of the high velocity wind of a high speed chase with just one panel. On an artistic level, this is another massive improvement on its predecessor. I mean, these pages are buttery smooth, there's no clunky dialogue or overcrowding of panels, just pure artistic spectacle. Which is why it sucks that it's kind of ruined by the fact that I literally just read this story in Polo and Roid. My only wish for Madmatic was for Toriyama to explore new grounds instead of defaulting to the same old tropes. And oh boy, am I gonna be saying that a lot throughout this video. To close off Volume 1, we have Chobit 1 and Chobit 2. Like I said earlier, the tropes and storylines are basically the same as the previous works. Tropes and storylines, mind you, that 6 chapters in, have already worn off their novelty. Here we see a cop who's a recycled version of the previous 2 MCs who gets into funny hijinks with this genie girl called Chobit. Hijinks that mainly include— Whoa, 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 whoa! I cannot show this on YouTube. Was this published in Shonen Jump? Okay. Questionable content aside, this one is just fine. It harkens back to the exclusively comedic panels of Toriyama's very early work, meaning that there's not much action and in consequence not as many big cool panels. Sometimes it works, most of the time it doesn't. I was already kind of done with Chobit halfway through the first one, but for some reason Toriyama just could not let it go and made a part 2. This manga wasn't even popular with Shonen Jump readers at the time. Again, Toriyama just made this out of sheer spite, which I respect, but the manga is still aggressively mid. Chobit 2 is the same thing as the first one, and yeah, that's it. That's the review. What I will say is that this is the first appearance of the character design that is literally just launched from OG Dragon Ball. And that was Manga Theater Volume 1! Overall, I can barely even remember what this volume was about. Obviously, the really early stuff was rough, but you expect it to be. It's with Polo and Roid that things start to pick up and we see a lot of the defining features of a Toriyama manga. From the big panels to the gag structure, we see it all evolve here in real time and it's fascinating. However, this is also where I start to grow pretty worried. The last few manga, while decent in some respects, followed a near identical formula that's not even that good. My main hope for Volume 2 and onwards is for Toriyama to actually experiment with the way he writes these pieces instead of just basically writing the same story with a new coat of paint. You know, if only for my own sanity. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. For this section of the video, I want to introduce something I'm gonna call the Toriyama Tropa meter. Basically, I'm going to introduce a series of tropes and cliches that Toriyama keeps coming back to, and whenever one comes up, you're gonna hear this ding. And when you do hear it, you're going to take a shot, or keep count, or whatever it is you want to do. Probably just do nothing. The first trope is having an overpowered main character who faces off against a cocky villain and proceeds to kick their ass. Basically a much worse version of David vs. Goliath. The second trope is a young male protagonist who is thrown into an adventure because of a girl. Because why else would he go on an adventure? And the third trope is questionable and, dare I say, problematic, gratuitous nudity of underage girls. Can I even talk about this on YouTube? This video doesn't even have monetization enabled and I'm worried I'm gonna get that yellow dollar sign. Speaking a little more seriously here, the amount of times that an underage girl either strips or is stripped naked in one of these manga is genuinely alarming and makes me wonder how A, any of this got past the tutorial, and B, how it was accepted by the public to begin with. It is not funny, it is very disturbing, and I'm glad this kind of trope has died out by now. This is a topic that's too serious and real for me to discuss in detail in this laid back video about comic books, so going forward I'm choosing to mostly ignore it and instead judge the manga entirely for its own merits as a work of art. But I want to make it clear that I heavily condemn this kind of material, and in no way is it acceptable today, nor was it acceptable in the 80s when it was published. This will be the only time I'm addressing this, so I hope you understand. With that out of the way, let's get back into goofy comics about punchy boys. For Manga Feeder Volume 2, I'm going to go a bit out of order. Let's start with the really boring manga that heavily borrow from tropes that I just discussed. Mr. Ho is Yamcha fighting the Red Ribbon Army because of a girl. The Elder is a worse version of Master Rochi who beats everyone up easily. And Pink is a manga I can barely even remember what it's about, but I do remember it had questionable content. We're already 3 points in the Tropa-meter, guys. No, the first manga that stands out in this book is Escape. And holy shit! Look at this page! It feels like something out of a Bernie Krigstein comic. This sharp sense of momentum as the character gets closer to the reader, the bigger, more realistic proportions that let her maneuver this three-dimensional space with more ease in comparison to the shorter character designs of the past with smaller proportions, and the panel breakups that serve the single image background of this comic is fucking beautiful. This one page surpasses comedy. And the tension doesn't end there as this girl runs to escape persecution. Like, I'm over here biting my nails while on the edge of my seat with my eyes glued to the page, Clockwork Orange style. And then the girl is caught. And then it was just hide and seek. And then she's like, you got me. That's it. Are you fucking kidding me? That's the whole comic? God forbid I have nice things. Here I was, more than ready for this Dragon Quest style adventure, but all I got was a finale that made me reconsider my life choices. This comic is the graphic novel equivalent of getting like a really nice birthday present from your sweet elderly grandma, and you're so excited, you're like, oh my god, thank you grandma, and then you open the gift and it's just like an empty box, and then grandma just fucking shoots you. Okay, I complain, but this manga is genuinely impressive on a technical level, especially its first 3 or 4 pages before it's ruined at the end. I would love to see more stuff like this, but sadly, due to it being just 4 pages, we do have to move on. No trope points for this one. You get 1. But now it's time to get into the big one that I feel some of you might be surprised to see. And that manga is none other than Dragon Boy. It's not Dragon Ball! So if you're unaware, when it comes to manga, oftentimes before the proper serial, the author makes a one-shot with the same setting or characters to kind of test the grounds and get an idea of how well a full series would do. One Piece had Romance Dawn, which had a very different version of Luffy. Death Note had the Notebook land in the hands of a not psychopath, and Dragon Ball has Dragon Boy, which has a lot of the same ideas. Our protagonist, Tang Tong, apologies if I completely butchered that, is identical to Goku. Not just in design, but also in fighting style. Look at these early panels of Tang Tong practicing his martial arts skills in these establishing shots of the Journey to the West inspired Chinese landscape. Again, it feels like something right out of the early pages of Dragon Ball. But how does Dragon Boy compare? Well, I was excited to find out, but unfortunately, this 12-page manga is mostly the same tropes we've seen so many times already. The only aspect that's new here is the setting and martial arts genre, except it's not even used to its full extent as Tang Tong defeats all his enemies with ease. What I will say is that it does try to create a bit more character with its 2 protagonists. The first is Tang Tong himself, who, just like Kid Goku, is naive yet powerful, and the princess who sets off the adventure, who's just being bratty all the time. If this sounds familiar, it's because this is the near identical dynamic of Bulma and Goku in early Dragon Ball. I feel like you could make something interesting out of having these 2 characters with conflicting personalities and forcing them to work together. But the fact that they don't have any other character traits other than naive and brat makes it so that they never evolve or grow. They just exist to be the mouthpiece for the next overdone gag. I guess you could say a lot of these things about the first arc of Dragon Ball as well, but at least then the series got enough chapters to actually develop its characters over a long period of time. Something Dragon Boy doesn't have. Except, does it? Nope, it didn't. But even though it never got a proper serial, it did get a second chapter with Dragon Boy Chapter 2. The same shit again, my god. Like, it's literally the same thing, barely anything happens. In fact, the trope of Tang Tong effortlessly defeating his opponents happens twice in one chapter. Like, Jesus Christ, I'm not even drinking and I'm already hammered. There are some noteworthy things here, like how we see some early designs for both Tao Pai Pai and Puar alongside some semblance of a story. But it's all lost in these cliches. Even the paneling isn't as solid as some of Toriyama's other works, with a lot of clutter and close-up panels. While Dragon Boy led to one of the greatest manga and anime series of all time, the actual manga itself leaves a lot to be desired. But guess what? Dragon Boy is not the only manga Toriyama made about a young kid going on an adventure with a girl to get a MacGuffin. Because we also have the Adventure of Tongpu. Damn, even the names are similar. The same thing as Dragon Boy, but with a sci-fi setting. A sci-fi that is actually pretty reminiscent of the Namek saga from Dragon Ball Z. In all honesty, I like this one a lot more than Dragon Boy. While the Chinese-inspired landscapes of the manga were cool, the constricted paneling never let it flourish. It didn't feel like Toriyama wanted to show us the environment so much so as he wanted to focus on the one-note characters. But here, we get shot after shot after shot of these beautiful landscapes that have this sense of three-dimensionality that Toriyama excels at. These panels give the impression that our protagonist can go and move in whichever way he pleases. You can tell that this work was heavily inspired by sci-fi classics like Star Wars and Alien to create something more unique than the other manga, even if the questionable content doesn't ever seem to come to an end. Sadly, this ends in the same way we've seen so many times as Tongpu fights against a Fox lawsuit in the making, my god. I really wanted to see Toriyama embrace the sci-fi aesthetic and do something new and different. Though I guess the silver lining is that this worked as some of the backbone for the Namek saga, which is like the best one. But even with that, the fucking Tropa meter is still on overheat over there. But you know what? I don't give a fuck. I paid for the whole Tropa meter, I'm gonna use the whole Tropa meter. Let's move on because our next one-shot is actually the last for volume 2. Young Master Kensuke, I don't know. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know how many points on the Tropa meter I'm going to add to this one? If you said 6, then you'd be completely incorrect because it's actually 0. What?
It's impossible!
Kensuke is a refreshing change of pace from the rest of the volume. Now, some of the old tropes are still present here, but they're presented in a different way that makes it a lot more tolerable. It follows the simple story of this kid called Kensuke who is spontaneously asked out on a date by this random girl. Not really knowing what a date is and fearing public humiliation, he goes on a quest to get a car so he can be the coolest guy ever and impress his date. It's so simple and all the jokes hit surprisingly well just cause the kid's naivety is so charming. My favorite part is the ending, where after all the trouble he went through to get this damn car, he goes on the date, crashes the vehicle immediately, and the girl calls him cringe. See, that's what you call a refined taste in comedy. In honor of the revival of my sense of humor, I will be inflicting the freeze status effect on the Tropa meter because the joke has already gotten old. And that was volume 2! Overall, I think I prefer the first one. While volume 1 was rough around the edges, at the very least it had novelty on its side as we got to see Toriyama's style evolve in his most formative years as a mangaka. Here, he has gotten way too comfortable with the same old formula that was already boring in volume 1. My favorite wasn't even the one-shot that set the building blocks to a media conglomerate, but the one of a kid with zero riz. I hope this final manga feeder volume picks things up a bit because reading this is starting to get annoying. And we're finally on the Hail Mary of manga feeder with our final volume. This one is mostly categorized by works made by Toriyama after Dragon Ball concluded, which means that some of these works will be quite different to what we've seen so far. There are some retreads of what we've seen already. Little Mama Jiro is a poor man's version of Kensuke. Karamaru and the Perfect Day is also a poor man's version of Kensuke. Well, okay, I actually kind of like that one. And lastly is Dub and Peter 1, which while different in some ways, it just doesn't stand out in comparison to the two I'm actually going to talk about. And those two are Cashman and Go Go Akman. Cashman is different, thank God. In essence, Cashman is Toriyama's take on the superhero genre. Now this is interesting. We know Toriyama has taken some influence from Western media, but we haven't seen this surface in obvious ways. In some instances, it's peaked its head, like Goku's backstory being really similar to Superman's, or the Great Saiyaman in the Buu Saga. But never have we seen a full-on Toriyama superhero. And I think it'd be a great fit. There are so many ways you can write a superhero. How will they manage their work and relationships? How will they manage their enemies and powers? How will they handle nuanced situations? The blank page of the manga is the only limit here. So, what does Toriyama do with it? Honestly, not much. Cashman is about an alien who crash lands on Earth and now needs to make a lot of money in order to buy the spaceship necessary to go back to space. So, he decides to make money by saving people from supervillains and petty crime, and then charging them for it. Which is kinda funny, like on paper, but in practice the joke gets old real quick. And really, that's all the manga has. The entire thing is derivative of this one mid-ass joke. I will say, the one part I thought was compelling was the second chapter where Cashman goes on a date and has to blend in as a normal human being. Like, you know, you could get some interesting relationship dynamics here. Maybe a Lois Lane Clark Kent kind of deal. But no, we just go back to a guy telling Cashman to eat shit before getting a hole in his stomach. Some interesting ideas here, but I just don't think it's that good, sadly. But you know what this means, guys? We're finally at the last manga of this long-ass hardcover that has gone on for so much longer than I've wanted it to. Our final manga feeder piece is Go Go Akman. By all accounts, this might be my favorite comic from the whole collection. Now this feels weird to say because Go Go Akman is, again, derivative. Jokes are the same, cliches are the same, the tropes will still haunt me in my nightmares. But this manga is long enough with sufficient new stuff to not make me want to commit honorable harakiri. Toriyama incorporates both his experience drawing story-driven manga like Dragon Ball and more gag-driven manga like Dr. Slump to create a decent mix of the two that, while still leaning on the gags, manages to create some characters I actually kind of maybe somewhat cared about. But first, the jokes. They are so much better. Like, take this part where a hitman showcases his abilities by shooting a perfect bullseye, breaking 5 bricks with his bare hands, and then using his level 2 certification in calligraphy to write the word nipple. Another moment I like is when this fighter is showcasing all his combat skills against Akman by like breaking boulders and shit. And then when it's time to actually fight, Akman just fucking shoots him. Straight up Indiana Jones him right there. Which is so much funnier than the Protag actually being physically stronger than him. It's so refreshing. The characters themselves are also fun. Sure, they're gag driven, but having so many bite-sized gags throughout these 64 pages helped me build even the slightest amount of attachment to them. So yeah, I rather enjoyed this one, and I find it to be slightly better than some of the other ones I've talked about so far. Even if it does still have questionable moments. Which means it is now time to close the book on Manga Theater. What a journey! In all honesty, this was so much worse than I thought it would be. Well, okay, I'm being a little unfair here. Volume 1 had a lot of novelty to it. The manga themselves were mostly lacking, but it was fun to see Toriyama's style evolve in real time. The same, however, does not apply to Volume 2, which was just so repetitive and boring. God forbid Toriyama make a manga that's not about a young boy who's really strong, who meets a girl, who takes him into a conflict that leads to him fighting a big bad guy and then immediately kicking his ass, and then Superman shows up to kick not Goku's ass, but then Superman stops fighting to tell Goku that Kamehameha is the quarter circle forward and not quarter circle back, and then it's after you do quarter circle forward that you can do the Kamehameha and safely super dash so that you can get easy damage. But then Goku tells Superman that, what the fuck are you talking about? That meta is like 5 years old and it doesn't work anymore. But then Superman super dashes anyway, and then they start making out. Things get a little hallucinogen near the end, but you get the idea. Volume 3 also had a lot of great stuff. To a certain degree, I enjoyed both Cashman and Akman. I get the impression that Toriyama wanted to make either or both of this series into a proper serial, but decided not to for some reason, which I think is reasonable, since I don't know if I would read an entire Cashman serial where it's just the same joke every single time. Overall, Volume 3 is nice, but it just doesn't compare to most manga, just generally speaking. If you want to read Manga Theater for the curiosity of it, or just to have this nice hardcover, then go ahead, but I wouldn't recommend it to someone who just wants to read good, enjoyable manga. And that is all for Akira Toriyama's Manga Theater. As you've no doubt noticed from the length of this video, Manga Theater is far from the end. You're probably thinking that I still haven't covered some of the rather popular miniseries he made post Dragon Ball, but that will come later. Because what you might not know is that not every one-shot that Toriyama made was compiled in the Manga Theater series. In fact, a good chunk of it was never even released in English, at least not officially. So, this is the part of the video where things get a little complicated, because in order to actually make the title of this video not be bullshit, I'm gonna have to do something a little controversial. That's right, I'm sailing the 7 seas to go on a quest to find the One Piece. So these unreleased works vary wildly in content. Some of them are multiple chapters long, similar to Cashman, while others are barely even 4 pages. So I'm just gonna go through all of them as best I see fit. Awawa World and Mysterious Rain Jack. You know earlier how I mentioned that Wonder Island was Toriyama's first work? Turns out I was totally trolling you. In actuality, Toriyama made 2 manga before Wonder Island that went initially unpublished because they were too shit. The first is Awawa World, which is a knockoff of Superman, and the other is Mysterious Rain Jack, which is a knockoff of Star Wars. Okay. These two are mostly the same as the early works pre-Polo and Roid I already talked about. They are extremely nonsensical, and honestly, I don't know if I even fully understood what they were about. But the thing that stood out to me more was that this is literally just Star Wars. What the fuck? At least in Awawa World, the character isn't Superman, it's Niku Man, so you can claim parody. But you can't do that in Mysterious Rain Jack. Dude, that's literally Luke Skywalker, you're not even trying to hide it. The main reason why this wasn't published initially was not just because of quality, but because his editor said it relied too much on Star Wars characters. Which, like, yeah, no shit. You can't just use copyrighted characters like this, that's not how it works. Dumbass Toriyama. Rocky. I don't know why this one is called Rocky. I thought it would be boxing related or something. It's funny, kooky guy thinks he's the shit and ends up in a car accident. Wolf. This is just the same as the last one, but with a wolf. Moving on. Alien X Peck. Again, it's the same cliched storyline, but I will admit that it does bring a few new elements to the table. For starters, our protagonist here feels like an actual realized character who grows and improves over the course of the story. He's still rather simplistic due to the restraints of a short manga like this, but the fact that he's not a naive child or an old pervert but an actual character with a proper arc makes him feel so much better realized than the others. This is helped by little details that help to color the world, like his obsession with apples and these cool and goofy designs for the goons. Not the greatest thing in the world, but I like it. Tokimeka, again a manga that, while similar in some respects, is actively trying to subvert all of the dumb Toriyama tropes. The main character is a girl who isn't over-sexualized, as low of a bar as that is, the Kid Goku stand-in is actually funny, and the action lends itself great to the setting and character designs. I particularly like the second chapter, which features the main girl and a cave woman fighting to the death. It's funny. Again, there are still a lot of moments where Toriyama goes back to his classic and overdone tropes, but I'll give it a pass for at least trying to move past this and making something that feels fresh. Majin no Bubul. Man, how come all the good ones weren't published in manga theater? This is a wholesome story with a nuanced set of characters and a conclusion that is oddly satisfying. Not much more to say other than, more stuff like this, Toriyama, please. Mahi Mahi the Lungfish. This is the best one-shot. This is the best one-shot and it's not even close. It's 11 pages of a lungfish, an animal I didn't even know existed before this, but it's just lungfish being a lungfish, and it's fucking hilarious. Look at this guy. Isn't he adorable? Toriyama really cooked with this one. Like, no joke, I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to read most of these manga, but this one put a smile on my face. I feel like the entire inspiration for this manga is that Toriyama looked at a lungfish in like TV or in a book or something and just said, hell yeah. Hyotam, same as the last one. A simple and wholesome manga that focuses on a more stylistic art style. The coloring here is outstanding and reminds me of some of the coloring you see in modern comics. Kentucky, I like the designs of some of the characters, but the story is underwhelming. I feel like you could have taken it and developed it into something more elaborate in a serial, but sadly we'll never know. And those are all of the unreleased one-shots. Overall, what the fuck, this is so much better! Most of these were made after Dragon Ball finished, which means they're more polished, which might influence why I feel the way I do about them. But even in the stories that succumb to Toriyama's cliches, I still think they either subvert them or did something new and interesting to make them compelling. But the highlights were the short manga that were only a couple of pages long. The lungfish was beautiful, Hyotam wonderful, Rocky kinda funny, I guess. I think you have enough stuff here to put it all under a type of Manga Theater Volume 4 and just publish it there. Really, I don't know why they don't do it. It would be like printing money. But with that, we have reached the final home stretch of this video. My god, has this taken so much longer than I thought it would. To round up our time with Toriyama and his work, we have his final hurrah. The Hail Mary he created before pretty much retiring from making manga. In his post-Dragon Ball years, Toriyama was just too busy with life to give much attention to long drawn-out works like his previous serials, so instead he settled on creating short 1 or 2 volume long miniseries that would tell a complete story. In total, there are 4 of these, 2 of which were officially released in English, while the other 2 weren't. So, I guess it's sailing time again. Regardless, these final works represent some of the best that Toriyama has to offer, and I really think that this is what this entire video, and in a way his career, has been building up to. Let's start with the series that started this trend. Kawa started publication almost immediately after Dragon Ball ended and is a complete 180 of what Toriyama had established himself to be up until this point. But also exactly what you expect after all the content we've discussed in this video so far. Specifically, a Halloween-themed children's manga that's similar to the previously discussed Majin no Bubul. And yeah, it's just more of the same types of gags over the course of his first 3 chapters. That all changes in chapter 4, where there's a sharp pivot in the direction of the manga by setting up a storyline that will encompass the entire rest of the series. The not Halloween town is struck with an illness, and only our protagonist and his buddy, whose name is fucking Jose, can help them by going on a journey to find the cure with the help of some wacky characters. It's a classic hero's journey set up with a focus not only on jokes, but on character development and goofy plot scenarios. Honestly, exactly what I'd want from a Toriyama miniseries. And he delivers. This man cooked here. The dialogue between the four characters is not only charming, but helps to set up who they are and what their goal is. Paifu is naive, childish, and just wants to help the knockoff Halloween town. Jose is, well, his best friend. There's not much more to him than that. But the highlight is Mako Lean, an ex-sumo wrestler who agrees to help the gang only in exchange for $10,000. $10,000 that Paifu promised to give him, but doesn't actually have. Mako Lean acts as this mean tough guy, but over the course of the story reveals himself to be both soft and kind-hearted. He wants the 10k so he can buy a boat and live out a peaceful life in the ocean, and when he eventually learns that the promised money doesn't actually exist, he forgives Paifu right on the spot. This is the best character by far. He and the rest of the crew help to elevate an already fun plot even higher. The chapters here focus on episodic conflicts of just goofy fun, like defeating the monster of the forest or defeating the witch to get the medicine to save the village. It's not an out of this world plot and it ends exactly the way you think it does, but god damn it does it do the job. I'll leave this with the final moments of the best character, Mako Lean. He's just finished the journey with nothing to show for it but the people he helped. He's a bit disappointed, but still happy. But that's when he hears and sees a boat coming from the distance. As a thank you, the village fixed up an old abandoned ship for him to live out his days in the ocean as Mako Lean gets his happy ending. It's heartwarming and sweet. Give this one a shot if you're curious. It's on the Shonen Jump app via Viz Media. Just 1 year after he finished up Kawa, Toriyama returned to the world of miniseries with Kajika, which has not been officially released in English. Awesome! Kajika is borderline better than everything else I've read so far, holy shit. Like, this ain't hyperbole. The difference in quality is so striking between every single other manga I've discussed so far and this. It feels like two different authors held the pen. But it's still distinctively Toriyama because Kajika feels like something straight out of the Buu saga from Dragon Ball Z, both in style and story. The plot is straightforward. Our titular protagonist has to deliver a dragon egg to an organization in charge of preserving the dragon species while a bounty hunter tracks him down. It's a classic cat and mouse type of story, and the fact that the problem in the story is so clear makes it engaging from the get-go. But more importantly, and I can't stress enough how happy I am because of this. Like, holy shit, I could go outside and just jump, scream of happiness. The protagonist here, instead of being this perfect overlord who never actually loses, struggles. Holy shit! I cannot believe it took this long to get to this point, but I am so happy. It is so much more entertaining to see the MC put actual effort into the problem instead of just winning all the time. And this is elevated by the plot, which focuses on the constant back and forth between the protagonist and the antagonist. This bounty hunter does not mess around and at times appears to be way stronger than the protagonist, which creates an obstacle that the main character needs to surpass, which then leads to him improving as a person, which then leads into character development. I'm so happy. Thank you for blessing me with an actual story arc, Papa Toriyama. But it's not just the story. The art here is Toriyama at his best. Unlike Kawa, which looked like the blockier, more cartoonish characters of pre and early Dragon Ball, Kajika strives for a look identical to the Buu saga or the late Dragon Quest games. These sharp features and slim builds for the characters give the paneling room to breathe and a real sense of depth. The gutter is like a dynamic camera that flutters between panels. The Kajika reading experience is smooth like butter, both in the text-based sequences as well as in the visual ones. This is in essence a shorter version of a Dragon Ball Z arc, and I'm all for that. This might be my favorite manga from Toriyama that I've read for this video, which is saying a lot. But yeah, hope to see this getting an official English translation someday. For our penultimate manga, and the last that was only released in Japan, we have Neko Majin. Unlike Kajika, this one goes back to Toriyama's roots and focuses exclusively on gag-driven episodic manga that go on for 8 chapters. Yippee. Honestly, I actually enjoy parts of this. At the center of this manga is its protagonist Neko Majin, who is this selfish yet well-meaning trickster. Surprisingly enough, I'd argue this manga is similar to some superhero comics. Neko Majin establishes a mythos early that these stories are built on, and later expanded upon with each chapter, which gives space for a variety of different stories. In the first 3 chapters, Toriyama sets the ground line for who this character is and what you can do with him. The first one is traditional Toriyama, which is kind of lame, but the second focuses on Neko Majin dealing with an alien invasion, which was actually really fun, and the third was him helping a down on his luck school teacher in this rather heartwarming tale. I actually quite love it. There's some action, yes, but I think the manga is at its best when you just have the characters talking to each other, much like a lot of my favorite superhero comics. I was so excited to see what other adventures Toriyama could create with this blank slate of a character. Unfortunately, I still have this curiosity. By chapter 4, everything I just talked about gets thrown out the damn window. Chapter 4 is a Dragon Ball Z parody, which is actually kind of funny. You got Super Saiyans, Kamehameyas, there's even a jab at Super Saiyan 3 with Neko Majin's transformation giving him double eyebrows. It's fine, whatever. And then chapter 5 is a Dragon Ball Z parody and... wait a minute. The entire rest of the manga is just a fucking Dragon Ball Z parody? That's right, you know all the rich world building from the first 3 chapters? Guess what? You can wipe your ass with it, cause nothing compares to making fun of Vegeta's forehead. And I'm not joking, Vegeta straight up shows up in this one. And Boo, and Frieza, and Goku. It ends up becoming more of a gag-driven Dragon Ball Z than anything we saw from the first 3 chapters. And it's not even that funny. Most of the comedy revolves around characters just seeing who can punch the hardest. Which I guess you could also say about Dragon Ball, but you know, it's not supposed to be funny so much as it's entertaining. Overall, the first 3 chapters I somewhat enjoyed, but did it really have to turn into Dragon Ball at the end? But whatever, with this we have reached the grand finale. This is a work that has surpassed all the others in terms of popularity, getting not only one anime, but a video game for some reason, and a cult following. We're talking about the iconic Sandland. You know, when I started reading this one, I kept asking myself, why of all the manga I've talked about so far, is this the most fondly remembered? Is it because it's a mini-series? Well, not really, since I've talked about 3 others. Is it because the overall style of the manga is most similar to Dragon Ball? Well, Kajika and Neko Majin also followed in the DBC footsteps, so that's probably not it. No, I think the reason for why Sandland is so beloved, and in consequence why it's so great, is because this manga is pure storytelling. The plot follows a group of 3 characters, including the demon Beelzebub, one of his followers Thief, and a human who we later learn is called Shiba, as they explore this Sandland in search for a rumored lake that will solve the drought impacting the Sandland. Wow, Beelzebub, what is this? Some kind of Sandland? But why do I say this manga is storytelling? Well, for once, and I think this is a first for these comics, there's no wish fulfillment. Previous works felt more like the power fantasy of the 13 to 25 male demographic. Big muscle fights, over-sexualized woman, fantasy adventure, it all serves to cater to the teenage dude. Now, this is literally the entire point of the shonen genre, which is why I don't think it's that big of a deal, and it's not like these comics don't go farther beyond to tell a good story. But Sandland takes a different approach by putting most of these things on the back burner and focusing on crafting a world and characters that just pull you in. There are long chapters dedicated to fleshing out character backstories, monologues developing the locals and lore of this Sandland. You learn that these characters aren't just looking for a lake to save their respective villages, but that there's this evil king who keeps all the water for himself while the rest of the world suffers. A king who always gets in their way and acts as this overruling force to their quest. All of the aspects that make storytelling and manga great are present, and I was thoroughly engaged for every one of these 14 chapters. We get character struggle, governmental corruption, conspiracies, and an escalating journey that leads to this genuinely exciting final battle that has all the great qualities of Toriyama's best. By all means, Sandland is everything I would want out of a short manga. Characters you love with a plot that keeps on giving, all of which leads to an ending that is equally climactic as it is satisfying. In any case, I feel like the story could have gone on for even longer, and I would have enjoyed it all the same. Sandland is the peak of Toriyama's work in these one-shots and short manga, and honestly, I'm glad that this is where the story ends. But wait, if that's the case, then where does that leave us? If Sandland is the final frontier, the last Hail Mary, the epitome of the king of manga, then where does that leave all his other work? Moreover, where does that leave Toriyama? Writing this conclusion was not easy. I am not a fan of a lot of the manga I've talked about. These works were absolutely necessary for us to get the magnum opus that is Dragon Ball. But reading through them, I don't know how valuable it was for me to sit through hours of panels that I only liked half of the time. I want to say it's given me a newfound understanding of Toriyama and manga, but I don't think I can say that with confidence. On a quality standpoint, while I want to be fair and say that a lot of these one-shots came from early in his career, at the same time, I feel like that's not enough to excuse them. This isn't even mentioning the absolute deplorable shit some of these comics had, which genuinely made me question my respect for this guy. I know that's a really harsh thing to say, and the last thing I want to do is ruin the memory of such an important figure in my life, but that's why it was so difficult to write this conclusion. Because if this is his life's work, then what are we left with? A bunch of mostly mediocre one-shots? Or is there more? Should I be glad that his final pieces were a great final hurrah? Or should I hold on to the past? I don't know if I have a satisfying answer to this. What I do know is that I don't think that problematic material or even mediocre work should tarnish the memory of somebody who left a much bigger impact. You know, both can be true. You can acknowledge that there's a lot of material in these manga that's not okay today, while at the same time acknowledging the massive impact that the author had in the world. These stories more than have their place in the world, and this is even without mentioning the ones that really resonated with me. On a quality standpoint, I don't recommend you go out of your way to read most of these works. And honestly, I highly doubt you were going to anyway. For every great panel, there's an overused cliche. For every goofy character design, there's inappropriate depictions of women. For every Sandland, there's a Chombit too. These are extremely niche pieces that will appeal only to the most diehard of manga fans or to comic scholars. They won't appeal to a wider audience today, but that's weirdly okay. Manga theater still exists, Kawa still exists, these countless worlds and characters that Toriyama created over the decades are still alive. To me, that's inspiring. When I pick manga theater off the shelf, I don't feel like I'm reading any other manga for the sake of pleasure, but that instead I'm reading a piece of history. Like a history textbook, there are parts that I read with unbashful pride, while at the same time there are other parts that I only look back on with shame. but that's okay because at the end of the day, couldn't we also say that about ourselves? Toriyama before, during, and after Dragon Ball was imperfect and complicated, but that's exactly what makes both him and Manga Theater special. That's the end of the video. Subscribe for more Dragon Ball, and I'll see you next time.